Now we're going to look at inflation. So inflation is a general sustained increase in the price of a basket of goods. The basket of goods is supposed to represent what typical consumers buy in terms of agricultural products, produce, manufactured items, but also personal services. So each basket of goods is slightly different in different countries, and it changes over time. For example, the UK this year added gin and bicycle helmets to the typical basket of goods by which they measure inflation. So inflation is normally identified as being a really negative phenomenon, but there are two things to think about. One is a low level of inflation can be good, as it gives us room for the real value of wages to decrease, which gives room to firms to increase productivity without representing all of that increase in the form of higher wages. They hope that their employees are fooled and don't ask for inflation matching increases. But also, if you're borrowing money, whether it's for consumption or whether it's for productive investment, so whether you're a consumer or a household or even a government, borrowing money, being in debt, is a good thing in the context of inflation, as the inflation erodes the real value of your debt. So a low level of predictable, controlled inflation is generally recognised as essential. So most Western governments have a target for inflation which is positive but low, so about 2%. But when we're thinking about inflation and when we're thinking about reactions that governments might take in order to curb inflation, we're assuming that this is a high or unexpected level of inflation, but we need to be really clear where the inflation is coming from before we embark on any inflation-reducing policies. So let's think about how we're going to represent inflation. So the first type of inflation we're going to think about is the inflation which is associated with high demand. So here we have an economy, a relatively low level of employment, a relatively low level of national income and national output. We engage in a stimulus of aggregate demand. This diagram is going to look very similar to the equilibrium, the last diagram in the equilibrium video. So remember, we stimulate aggregate demand by either using a monetary and fiscal policy to encourage household consumer spending, or firm investment, government spending, or to stimulate the balance of trade. So here, because the inputs in the economy are fixed, we've run out of employment, of unemployed workers, we've run out of spare capacity, we've run out of inputs, and the stimulus that we've engaged in going from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2 has run out of spare capacity and has resulted in inflation. So in this scenario, what we want is to have a midway point where we have a higher level of employment, income and output than we had at stage 1, but a lower level of inflation. So we're trying to, at this point, contract aggregate demand from here to here. So if we think about how we might contract aggregate demand, well, we need to go back to the different components of aggregate demand. So can we reduce the demand that comes from consumers? Well, we could engage in a fiscal policy such as higher employment taxes or higher sales taxes. So this is going to reduce aggregate demand. We could work through our fiscal policies to affect the behaviour of firms and investment. So we could introduce a corporate tax, which again is going to reduce the component of aggregate demand that comes from firms. We could look at the government behaviour itself. So the government is an employer, but it also pays for public goods and merit goods. So we could reduce government spending so that we move from aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 3 by engaging in some austerity policies. So the result is going to be a slightly lower level of national income, a slightly lower level of output and a slightly lower level of employment, but we have brought down inflation. So demand pull inflation, the kind of inflation that was endemic to Europe in the 1970s, is relatively easily addressed. The only thing we need to consider is the fact that the policies to reduce aggregate demand are going to take some time to filter through. So we might expect it to take between 1 and 2 years to see the benefit of our aggregate demand contraction. The other route by which we get inflation is when there's a shock to the cost of our inputs. We call this cost push inflation. So as you can see, the impact of cost push inflation is hitting our economy in terms of its impact on aggregate supply. So it affects the costs of inputs, whether these are agricultural products, which we saw become much more expensive across Europe in the early part of 2017 because of bad weather conditions in Spain, so food prices increased. We tend to see it in the cost of oil, if there's an oil price shock, or the cost of utilities, so gas and electric prices, which impact consumers but also impact producers. So essentially, the shock of an oil price or another input price rise shifts the whole aggregate supply curve to the left. So any given level of aggregate demand, so initially this was our price or inflation level, this was our level of employment, national income, national output. This input price shock drives us to this point here. So we've got a level of inflation, we've got a higher we've got higher prices to pay, and we then have a higher rate of unemployment. So we've seen employment fall, we've seen national income and national output fall. So cost push inflation has a serious impact on the economy, but because it's driven by input prices, it's much harder for the government to have any direct influence over this inflation. So in the long term, they can try to encourage a shift away from this expensive and inflationary input. But in the short term, it's very difficult to offset, and it's likely that the economy will face inflation, which it has to absorb. And the absorption of the inflation is likely to come in the form of higher unemployment, higher prices, and deterioration in people's standards of living.